Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tatiana Melo, the coordinator of the postgraduate program in economics at UNESP. Thanks everyone who is watching us on YouTube, and especially thanks Professor Eric Scorsone for joining us today. First of all, I'd like to say that it is a great honor for us to welcome Professor Scorsone for sharing with us his perspectives of institutional economics on this 30-day of event. Thanks, Professor. Now, my colleague and our PhD student, Rodrigo Constantino, will be in charge for introducing Professor Scorsone to the audience. Thank you, Rodrigo.
Great. Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you to all my colleagues here. Thanks to all who are watching us on YouTube and those who are here in this call. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today with Professor Tatiana and Professor Eric Scorsone. It's a great honor to introduce Eric to this audience because today Eric is our keynote speaker. He's going to talk to us about the construction of a legal language to enhance economic analysis. And it's a great opportunity for us because Professor Eric Scorsone just wrote a book with Sarah Clemmer from Michigan State University. The book is called The Legal Foundations of Micro-Institutional Performance, a Heterodox Law and Economics Approach. And we have in firsthand the opportunity of listening to the author of the book and discuss his perspectives on institutional economics. So I've met Professor Eric Scorsone as he kindly hosted me at Michigan State University last year as a visiting scholar. And he supervised me in a project on John R. Commons' economic theory. I have to say, a lot of things that I knew about Commons and the way I read Commons have changed after this experience with Dr. Scorsone. So thank you, Eric. I appreciate you being here today with us. So Professor Eric is the former director and associate professor at the Extension Center for Local Government, Finance and Policy at Michigan State University, especially in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics. So Michigan State University is in East Lansing. It's almost the capital of Michigan. That's Lansing. So Eric now is the chief of staff and board secretary of MSU's board of trustees. And he has a long experience in local government, public policy, and economic development. So Eric is also a member of the Association for Evolutionary Economics. And before Eric starts, I would like to thank you on behalf of our program and also on behalf of the young scholars in Brazil who are studying institutional economics. I'm sure that this opportunity, these connections we're creating today are huge steps in this effort to spread the study of institutional economics here in Latin America, especially in Brazil. So thanks, Eric. Thanks for everyone who's watching us, and everyone have a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk for a little while and then hopefully take some questions, have some discussion. Yeah, in my current role, I've moved out of the teaching and into sort of governance of the university, which means I'm using this stuff in real life, and because Michigan State University is a government essentially, and so we deal with all kinds of legal challenges and how law shapes what we do as a university, whether it's teaching, research, buying and selling land, all kinds of things. We're essentially a city. We have a power plant, a water plant, police and fire officers, etc. So, and also I had to share a story because it may be hard for someone in Brazil to imagine, but Rodrigo and I and Sarah spent several days at the University of Wisconsin in probably some of the coldest weather we've ever experienced. I'm sure Rodrigo for sure. And it was in January and it was probably, below 0 Fahrenheit. So, but we had a great time because we got a chance to dive into the archives for John Commons, and I think got out a lot of information that we still have to go through. But institutional economics is actually one of the oldest forms of economics, actually. And even though today it's considered maybe a small part of the field, but I think it is actually growing again. Probably most importantly, the 2009 Nobel Prize for Eleanor Ostrom, who was from Indiana University near just south of us here at Michigan. And so, it's a field that has probably struggled in some ways. Our focus here is institutional law and economics. And I start with this picture because these are some of the figures from the past who, helped set the foundation for this work. And they're not nearly as well known as Adam Smith or, people like that. I was just in Edinburgh, Scotland. I took a picture next to the Adam Smith statue, but people know Adam Smith, or they know, if you're in economics, you might know Paul Samuelson or people like that. We have John Commons, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, Wesley Holofield, Thorstein Veblen, and the woman here is Sarah Rodenbush, who's these are economists, again, not as well known. Some would even be called sociologists in some cases by people, but they helped form the foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about how they've helped us kind of get to where we are. One of the things I like to start with is, and I apologize, a lot of my examples will be US focused, just by nature where I am, but probably you have some similar stuff in Brazil, I'm sure. So people often talk about the free market, for example. And the first question we ask in institutional economics is, what do words mean? And what are people saying? What is the rhetoric behind language? So one of my mentors, Warren Samuels, who was a long time, real quite well-known economic historian of economic thought. And he really taught us to think about what do we mean by these terms we see. And this is a term you see all over the newspapers or media. And so, what does this mean when we say free market? And one of the things our tools help you do is break that down and really understand, what is this free market thing? What does it mean? And really breaking it down to its component units. Because in economics, we often talk about free markets without really thinking about what we're meaning. In fact, you'd probably sit in a lot of microeconomics classes, and there would be this sort of underlying assumption of some kind of legal system, right? I mean, we're buying and selling goods, but we don't live in anarchies generally. So, there's a whole legal system that underpins these things, and we don't really pay attention to it. You might hear some, teachers talk about property rights or something, but very rarely is that interrogated or really understood. What does that even mean? The assumption is just simply there is a legal system, a court system, a system of contract enforcement, etc. So when we say free market, it makes it sound like, just free, like there's no legal system involved, nothing. But in fact, there of course is. You also hear the term economic freedom. This is an opinion of a US representative from Congress talking about, America should promote economic freedom at the climate change, one of the climate change meetings. But again, what is freedom for who? Freedom for what exactly? So again, these terms are often thrown around in economic discourse without really knowing what they mean. And institutional economics, if nothing else, is about stopping and asking basic questions about things like freedom or free market. Another classic one is externalities. There was this thing about how I like this article. This article is interesting because they use the word market failure. This is the New York Times. So first off, what does that mean? Failure relative to what? And of course, in traditional terms, we talk about perfect markets and then failure from that. Then they use this term government intervention, which again makes it sound like somehow the government is outside the system and that the government comes into the market, as opposed to the government and the market are co-created simultaneously. And that's what we call the legal economic nexus. That's the name of our podcast. And that's because we believe the two are co-created and coexisting all the time. It's not this notion of government intervention, again, is making it sound like somehow the government's not involved. There's just a market and the market's kind of working. And then all of a sudden the government has to intervene in that market. Now that sounds like a little bit of wordplay, but in reality, it really matters, right? Because that matters how you think about, because it's easier to say the government should not intervene. You know, like that's a way to frame an argument to say government is bad. Government is always doing things wrong. So it's the way we use these words, even externality, in fact, makes it sound as if, you know, it's external. It's something outside the system that somehow, you know, in many cases, there's many externalities we don't even talk about, but actually are very important. So for example, if I start a business and I take business away from you, that's an externality, in fact. Now it's through the market, and we call it a pecuniary externality. In fact, you may never even heard the term because in most textbooks, they never talk about this, but it is in fact an externality. And so that's what I mean. These terms and words, we really have to interrogate, think about what they really mean. And so again, government intervention, free market, market failure, all of these things that have become very commonplace that almost any, even someone that just took an economics class, you know, as part of their undergraduate curriculum, maybe even in secondary school, you know, would learn a lot of these terms. And then they're used in things like the New York Times in this case. So let's talk a little about, given some of those examples, so what is institutional economics at heart? Now, I want to be clear, there's many approaches to institutional economics. And in fact, that's probably one of the challenges is that there are many approaches. And so there isn't like neoclassical has the advantage because it's sort of one coherent model that like is in all kinds of textbooks and is taught all over the world. And it's fairly uniform. And institutional really isn't. It's messy, it's pluralistic, it's sort of not as coherent as neoclassical. And that's probably, unfortunately, a disadvantage in this case for adoption of ideas. But I think in reality, the world is a messy place. And so I think it probably better reflects the real world in many cases. But I want to be clear, like there's things like new institutional economics, which is the term that's often used for things like Ronald Coase or, Douglas North, people that have won the Nobel Prize. And that's, they do institutional economics, and I absolutely believe you can learn things from them. Don't get me wrong. What we're going to talk about is a little different than some of that stuff, for example. Two things I think are key. One is that institutions are things that shape our decision-making. And so that's one really key element of institution, no matter what school of institutional economics you're talking about. Habits of thought is what Thorstein Veblen thought about. He was thinking more about culture and how culture and sort of habits shape our thought. And then Commons is the other really big figure. And he was thinking more about law and formal rules. But at the end of the day, they both kind of function as institutions, really. They're just sort of different types of institutions. The other big piece is institutionalists were doing behavioral economics before it became real big. I mean, in my department today, behavioral is one of the biggest things, right? Everybody wants to do experiments. Everybody wants to do behavioral economics research. That's kind of, I mean, if you go to the American Economics Association, it's like literally the dominant thing right now. But Veblen is the first one to do this, right? He's the first one who said, people aren't rational. He had this great language. It's very archaic language, but he talks about people aren't lightning calculators of utility and so forth. And he was really the first one to say, look, people follow customs, they follow habits, they look at their neighbor. I mean, he designed the idea of conspicuous consumption, like I consume because I want to look important. And so I buy like a certain type of car because I want to portray myself in a certain way. And so he was the first one in the Theory of the Leisure class book, which is actually a book read in, you know, English literature classes is probably more so than even economics, actually. But it's a really key insight. But again, now that's really big, really popular because of people like Richard Thaler and others. But institutionalists were doing behavioral economics. Now again, it's messy. There isn't one model. So it does get messy because everybody has different ideas of behavior and you know, when you go from rational to something, the argument is, and it's probably true, that there are like a whole bunch of different models of behavioral economics today. Like every situation, every context probably has a different model. So it is a messy world, but again, in many ways, the real world is messy. And I feel like, you know, hate to say it, but as you get older, you probably feel like more and more you sort of get that idea. Institutional analysis, generally, we're thinking about collective action. And again, collective action could be you work within a company, and that company has a set of rules you have to operate by, or a university, or even a family, like a family, right? Your family will have a set of rules by which you all kind of agree to abide by. And what's critical, the way we think of it, is that a lot of people think of rules as sort of only a constraint, like I can't do something. But in fact, often when I can restrict someone's behavior, I'm actually expanding someone else's behavior. So we really focus on this interdependence idea, that essentially there's sort of pieces going on there on both sides. And we think about this can be like in a family, you may write it down, like the parents may write down the rules for the kids, for example, or something, but in many cases it may be informal. Obviously with law, you have formal structures, you know, that are written down in constitutions and statutes, etc. But all these institutions are playing these roles, and these institutions evolve over time, right? They change, they change for both intentional and unintentional reasons, right? Especially culture, we don't generally intend to change culture in a certain way. Cultures evolve and change over time. So again, that's kind of the core of institutional analysis, which is much different than, say, a neoclassical analysis, where basically you just need to know budget constraints, preferences, and those preferences are generally fixed, right? And then with firms, you need to know the production function or the cost function, and then you basically work out a market, right? And so what we're saying is that's fine. I mean, I'm not opposed to neoclassical analysis, I should be clear. It's just that it doesn't really capture a lot of the real world in many cases. In fact, what I would argue typically is that neoclassical is like a special case that does in some cases work, but probably doesn't describe a lot of the real world. And so it can work, and under certain conditions it can work, but I would say in many cases it doesn't. So some basic definitions we use: going concern. This is any kind of social unit, everything from families to religious organizations to neighborhood groups. There's literally millions of these going concerns out there, and we're all part of multiple of them at any given time. Right? I work at a company, I'm in a family, I go to a church, you know, so I have all these different rules that I'm sort of embedded with. And the key words we use in the English language would be must, must not, can, and cannot. That's really key, right? Because must and must not are really restrictive kind of things on one side. Can and cannot are giving you a little more discretion. So we have rules that do different things. Also, rules work at different levels. You can have rules at the federal level, constitutions. You can have rules at the local level, and you can have rules so you have rules at different levels, and those rules interact with each other, right? So some rules may overrule another rule. We also use these Latin terms, in personam and in rem. Some rules are very particular to me, to you, like a contract that would be between two parties, maybe more, but generally speaking, it's a fairly specific kind of thing. In rem, in Latin, means against the whole world. So if I have a property right, a literal land right, that you can't enter my land, that may be against the entire world in theory, like against anyone. No one can enter my land or trespass without my permission. So you have these different ideas like that. Just quickly, formal institutions are codified in text or opinion. They're probably a little bit easier to analyze, and there are tools to do this. Now, economists are not typically trained in these tools because there's things like codification, linguistic analysis that probably one has to get a little more familiar with, but this is very common in other areas like legal scholarship. So if you're going to do empirical analysis, you've got to code either as discrete variables or whatever it is. And that can absolutely be done. And there's many journal articles there that show you how to do that. Informal institutions are not codified. So again, this is cultural stuff. Like the cultural rules are when you get somewhere, you wait in a queue or a line, and like you don't cut that line. Now that may not be a law, like they're not maybe like a government wrote the law down. You don't cut in line, quote unquote, or the queue. But but I've seen this in different places. Like I was in back at my home, my ancestral home of Italy, and there that they don't really line up in queues very well. They sort of, it's very chaotic, and like if you're trying to get on an airplane, everybody just sort of crowds around and tries to get on the plane. And whereas in the United States, it's always very organized. There's like all these different lines for all the different types of customers and everything. So again, there's just different cultures of how you do things, and those things aren't always, they're harder to codify. Now, obviously, sociologists, anthropologists have figured out ways to do this. It may be qualitative in nature, but obviously this kind of research does go on. So institutional law and economics, we're more focused on the legal pieces. Generally, I mean, we do think about informal, but probably more so we tend to be focused on formal stuff. And we're going to ask, again, basic questions like who owns what and why? Like, why do we assume because something's owned by somebody, that's the right way to do it? Because, if you're not a cost to someone, you don't have power. Like one of the ideas we have is that like to be able to impose a cost is essentially a form of power. And who has to buy what, right? I mean, 50 years ago, factories could easily pollute and they would use the air for free, essentially, right? They didn't have to, they were essentially owning the air and they were causing health damage to others. Nowadays, of course, that's generally not the case. They have to either, impose certain technological things on the factory to reduce pollution, or they have to, purchase credits to, if they're going to emit certain levels of pollution. So now we've changed those ideas of who owns what, right? So rules can change, rules do change. And one of the key things we talk about in ILE is that efficiency is one of the really big ideas in neoclassical is efficiency, right? We hear this a lot. Well, this is efficient. And if you don't do this, you're having efficiency losses, or you're costing something to society, quote unquote. But in our minds, efficiency is always a function of the rules. And so you have as many efficiencies as you have rule structures. And there's no one efficiency better than another. In fact, if you actually go back and look at welfare economics textbooks, they will actually say this. And teachers don't often emphasize this point that in fact, there's like an infinite number of efficient points ultimately. And they're all non-Pareto comparable. So essentially, this idea that somehow efficiency, we found this way of being value neutral and making decisions about policy. We didn't actually. And so one of the things I always talk about is why efficiency is really a problematic idea in the way it's used. It's perfectly fine to talk about efficiency. And if you're a company, you can absolutely think about, am I efficient or not, relative to my company or relative to whatever. But in fact, in other cases, you sort of, we see this term used as a weapon, to be quite frank, as a rhetorical tool to say, your idea is not efficient, right? That's a way to sort of put something down or say it's not a good idea. So that's a critical idea to think about. So what is our approach specifically in our book? This is our book, Legal Foundations of Microinstitutional Performance, through Edward Elgar. We called it specifically heterodox, and I'm going to talk a little bit. I want to focus on a couple key ideas. But first, let me introduce you to Wesley Newcomb Holofield. He was actually a law professor at Yale University. He died fairly young from, I believe, cancer. His most important essays, which are, quite hard to read, partly because they're old language, old English kind of way of speaking, but his fundamental legal conceptions. And in fact, what he was doing was saying rights aren't about what I own, like the physical stuff, like I own this car or I own this house. Rights are about relations between people. And his ideas were fundamentally in shifting the way lawyers think and legal scholars. And then he influenced like John Commons. And what we've tried to do is kind of take that and put it into modern language and help economists see how it can be used today. But it's really a language. And so the title of the presentation was about this language. And this is where we get to this language, giving the tools of a language of how to talk about this law. Because law, at least in the United States, I don't know Brazil law, of course, but in the United States, every time I transact with someone, there's a whole legal system underpinning that, whether I know it or not. I mean, I may go into a store, buy something, take my credit card out, boom. I have literally engaged in multiple legal transactions without even knowing it, quite frankly, because I've never bothered to read all the fine print of what all this stuff says, right? But like it has all kinds of rules about whether I can return this item, whether I can, what happens if it's a flawed item, can I get compensation if it hurts me or something, like there's an entire legal system around all these transactions. Now, most transactions are fine. The product isn't flawed, right? I mean, it's okay. But in fact, the very notion of me giving money to someone, even that, like, especially when it's all electronic and there's no actual money being exchanged, we're all relying on this legal system it's involving both us, the merchant and the buyer. It's involving our respective banking systems, right? There's all this stuff going on behind the scenes, and economists have tended to ignore all that. And Holofield helps us bring it out to the forefront and say, what does this all mean? And what if it changes? What happens? Is it working well? Do we want it to work differently? Now, Holofield, to be clear, did not have anything of this in mind. His whole thing was to clarify law. He felt lawyers were not speaking clearly. So he did not have any idea about economics. But so what we try and do is say, neoclassical, and again, I think neoclassical is fine and can absolutely be used in some context, but it's about budget constraints and fixed preferences to predict behavior. What we're saying is, no, you've got to bring in all this legal and in some cases, cultural ideas. How does that shape decision making? So that's all we're doing is saying, now we call it heterodox because law and economics, the traditional law and economics that you would most likely see in a lot of economics departments is neoclassical law and economics. It's about applying rational choice models to the law. And basically what it tends to do is say, this way of doing the law is wrong, basically. Like your tort law, which is the law of sort of when something goes wrong and who's at fault, right? It is a flawed system. It's not efficient. Generally, they use efficiency to beat up the current system and say why their idea is better. So that's kind of the traditional neoclassical law and economics approach. Our approach is saying, in a way differently, of saying, how does the law shape economics as opposed to how does economics shape the law? So we're really reversing course and saying it a little differently. And we think it is heterodox because we think the mainstream is pretty well embedded, and the University of Chicago has done a very good job indoctrinating not just economists, but judges, in fact, as well. Many judges in the United States are very much like law and economics scholars. So again, I want to emphasize that interdependence is critical between people, and that you can't sort of only look at one side of the equation. You've got to look at both sides. And one of the things we think about is this sort of defines your opportunity set and constraints. So it sort of helps you define what are your options? Because if I'm under, and I'm going to go into this more detail, like certain legal systems, in essence, create constraints for how I can act, versus a different legal system that may expand my opportunity set. So in essence, we can use some traditional economic ideas even to sort of frame how we think about this. So what have we contributed? We've contributed, we think a language for economists. Again, fully acknowledging our sort of heritage to Holofield and Commons, and giving, but also giving legal scholars also some tools. And we're in dialogue with legal scholars as well to kind of think about how they, because quite frankly, a lot of them have seen the economics and said, we don't like this economics because they're basically learning neoclassical. And we're trying to show them, well, there's a different way of thinking about this. And again, the term that our mentor, Warren Samuels, used was the legal economic nexus. And his point there was just that the two systems interact in a continuous manner. Now, is that messy? Yes, of course. I mean, ultimately, you probably have to start and do analysis from one side or the other, but you have to at least be clear in recognizing that they work together. So I've talked about this. I mean, why heterodox? Why micro? Because quite frankly, a lot of heterodox has been focused on macroeconomics, and that's great, and I'm all for it. And I've done a lot of applied macro myself in my career, but I think the micro is ultimately, you know, really the core of economics remains micro. I mean, macro is great, and that's what you hear in the news. I mean, like right now, inflation and all that kind of stuff, and that's the stuff that gets the markets going and all that kind of thing. But micro is really still the foundations of economics. So, you know, macro is always very exciting, but we think micro is where the real starting point has to be. So let me talk a little. I'm not going to go in great detail, but let me talk a little bit of how this works. So, and I know that hopefully you can get through the language. I know it's, you know, we're talking through different languages here, but the rights, you know, we think about a right, you know, we always think about the right as sort of like, oh, I get to do this, or I get to say whatever I want, or whatever it is. In our model, the way a right you think about is really, it's about what you can get somebody else to do. That's the key. So like the right to free speech is a good example. Like that's Article 1 of the U.S. of the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution is free speech, right? What does that really mean? Well, what that really means is I have a right to free speech, which basically means other people are under a duty to not interfere with me speaking. But here's the key thing that people haven't realized. It's the duty on who exactly? And in our case, at least, it's a duty on the government to not, the government can't prevent me from speaking. And this is what the whole, you know, ever since the Trump stuff was like, well, Twitter or Facebook are not government actors. They're private actors. They don't have a duty to not stop you from free speech. They can shut you down if you violate their rules. So as a going concern, they have their own set of rules about free quote unquote speech. And they're different from what's in the US Constitution. If they believe you're saying something that is hurtful to others or to incite violence, they can shut you down. And in fact, they have. And then people say, well, this isn't right. Well, it's like, well, we're not a government. We're not under these rules of free speech. And so this is what's interesting. Okay, well, where do these rights and duties lie? And so that's one of the key things our tool helps you do is ask, when there's a right involved, you've always got to go to the other side about duty and who, under what duty and to whom and where. And that's the key, is to understand a right is to go to look for the duty side. And that forces you to think about interdependence. It forces you to think about who's on the other side and what are they under a duty to do? And then where does that duty end? Because you don't have a free speech right to yell, you know, the classic example is yell fire in a theater. You can't do that. If you do that and you cause a panic, you would not be protected then. You wouldn't have, that right would go away. And in fact, they would flip on you at that point, potentially in terms of criminal liability for if someone was killed, for example. So rights and duties are never absolute. That's another key point of our model. So again, the duty, I think we've talked about enough, but they're together. And the duty is about a constraint, or it's a forcing you to act. But in either case, it's probably changing your opportunity costs, right? It's changing, like, you have to do something or you can't do something. So it could be either side of that. And it could be now or in the future. So so duties and rights kind of go together, and they're really critical in understanding the legal system. And we're going to walk through some examples here in a sec. Privilege. This is a key thing that what Holofield did, because what he felt was happening was people confused rights with privileges. So, and we've really tried to hammer this home in the book about a privilege means I have the ability to do something. But what it doesn't do is there's no duty on the other side. So I have a privilege to park in a certain parking spot, but you may also have a privilege to park in that same parking spot. So if you get there first, I don't have a right to that spot. You have a duty to not be there. Now, if I pay extra at Michigan State University, I do get the right because I paid extra for that spot. And so that can happen. And then I'd have to call the tow truck and get you removed and everything. But the bottom line is, if it's just a general spot, like fact, they're always fighting for parking. In that case, we each have privileges to park there. Like I paid my minimal fee to park at some spot, but not one specific one. And that's really critical, because what Holofield found in the law was that judges were saying privileges were rights. And he was saying, no, you're not being clear here. You're calling the wrong thing, and that matters. And so again, the other side of a privilege is an exposure, which just means I'm exposed to damage from you. You can do an action that will damage me. I have the right to start a business, a shoe store down the street from your shoe store, and take business away from you. Right, and that in economics, that's a pecuniary externality. The only externalities economics cares about is technological externalities, but that is an externality. The reason we say we don't care about it is it goes through the quote unquote goes through the market. But in reality, you're exposed, and I have the privilege to open the business. At the same time, you're the current business owner. You have the privilege to act and do something about it. Right, so I can't stop you. So it's a very different situation. Now, let's say a different thing happens. I am an employee of your business, and I decide to go start a similar business nearby. But when I already signed a non-compete agreement, which is a legal agreement saying that I agree for 2 years not to compete with you if I leave. So if I sign that contract willingly, now I'm under a duty not to start the business versus having that privilege. So again, you can see how the rules can change quickly depending on whether that kind of agreement is allowed. And if it is allowed, do I enter into that agreement? And there are a lot of businesses that do that to you, especially if you're in law firms, accounting firms, things like that. They'll often have these kinds of agreements, because it's very easy, if I'm a lawyer, for example, to say, I'm going to go start my own law firm and I'll take all my clients with me, right? And so one of the things they try and do to protect themselves is say, you can't do that. Now, whether those agreements are enforceable can be an issue, of course. So the way we think about this is in these tables. So you have a right correlated to a duty, and you have an exposure correlated to a privilege. So it goes both ways. But the other key thing this table allows you to say is, when does that right end and that exposure begin? And when does the duty end and the privilege start? So at some point in our relationship, I flip from duty to privilege, meaning I can now act or not act, either, actually both ways. And my rights end and I'm exposed to your actions now. So this table is very simple, but it just allows you to start thinking about the situations and how they're really structured. The others get a little more complicated, but there are 4 other relations. One is power. The H is just referring to Holofieldian. I apologize. So it's just Holofieldian power, as opposed to sort of general power ideas. A power just means I can change our relationship. So I can enter a business, any business that's open to the public. I can enter that business and essentially buy the product, and that business can't say, no, I'm not going to sell to you. Okay, if they're open to the public, the rule in the US by long tradition, going back to England, is that you can't stop them from coming in. Now, this has been a big battle over racial discrimination, all kinds of other things, but But the rules in the US, generally speaking, are that if I am open to the public, I can't sort of say, well, I'm open to this public, but not this public. Right now, those rules weren't always the case. In fact, I mean, even though that's sort of the common law tradition going back hundreds of years to England, actually, there was a long time in the US where that wasn't the case, where certain types of people couldn't enter certain businesses. They were not allowed to. And so this has changed over time. But a power means I can sort of cause something to happen, meaning I can essentially impose a duty on you. This is a way to think about it, the best way, probably. The liability is just the other side. I am at a liability. Now, I want to be clear, because we often think of these terms in sort of financialized terms, like liability means somehow like a cost or a debt that I owe. You have to be careful here, because obviously if I enter a business, like the common idea is a hotel or an inn or something. So, and this goes back to England, as long as there's a vacancy, an opening. If there's no vacancy or opening, I am not under a duty to provide you something. And that's why in the United States, you'll see hotels that have signs up front, and they will very explicitly say no vacancy. And that's because the law requires them to say that, so that it's clear to everyone there's no vacancy. So they can't do, like, you come into the hotel and they're like, they look at you and say, I don't like this guy. No vacancy, So it has to be communicated clearly to everyone. It doesn't mean I still have to pay. I mean, I can't say I want a room and I'm not going to pay for it. Like, it's not a liability in the sense of like, now I'm going to lose money because you don't have to pay for the room. You obviously have to pay. So it's a liability in a legal sense, not in a financial sense. You're still going to get money for the room. And if you're a good business owner, you're going to probably make a profit. So it's not a liability in that financial sense. So I just want to be clear, like, when we're talking about this liability idea. And then immunity is essentially when that legal power ends, and disability is just when the immunity ends. And so again, same table. I go from having a power to being disabled from having a power. I go from a liability to being immune, meaning you can't impose something on me. So these all kind of work together as the sort of called Holofieldian relations. And this seems very simple in a way, and it is very simple in some ways, but it's actually challenging to apply. But at the same time, once you figure it out, it actually really clarifies a whole bunch of stuff and how systems really work. And so this is the full table. Right privileges, power immunities. You can kind of break them out to like what's opposites and what's correlated. And I won't go into all that detail right now, but that's generally the way it works. So the way we kind of think about our model specifically is like, how do we do this? Like, so we use a model called situation in SIP, and I'll go through it. So first of all, we look, what is the situation? So you look at a situation like, say, Uber or whatever it is, and so you need to understand who's transacting with who's the parties involved in this situation. And let me stick to like the hotel owner and the customer, and then of course behind that is the government who's enforcing some kind of legal system. So you sort of trying to understand all the collective action going on, all the rules. In some cases, you have to consider biophysical factors. If it was agriculture or an environmental issue, there may be things like that to factor in. And then we're going to use Holofieldian language to sort of understand the status quo. And then what would a change in the status quo look like? So situation is just kind of getting your facts in line and understanding the case where you're dealing with. And then the question is, where do we go from status quo to different alternatives? And there are going to be multiple ones, maybe 2 or 3, maybe more. But here you're going to identify from both real world academic literature, so forth. You're going to do a comparative analysis, and you're going to say, what if the right duty changes to a privilege exposure or to a power disability change, and then you're going to sort of have several different scenarios where you're going to understand how this could be structured differently. And the key here is to say the status quo, the way things work, doesn't mean they have to be that way. Okay, they can be that way, but there are probably alternatives. And those alternatives have benefits and costs to each party. So what we end is with performance analysis. We ask the question, who gets what? We're asking distributional questions, not efficiency questions. We're going to use quantitative and qualitative analysis. We're going to use ex post and ex ante analysis. We're going to use rational choice and maybe non-rational choice models, okay, to think about performance. And so in essence, you start with a problem, you think about interdependence and that current structure, you think of institutional alternatives, how the structure could be different. So example, like Uber drivers are contractors, Uber drivers are employees, right? In the US, that's a big battle. And that matters because if they're employees, they're very different situation, very different structure than if they're just contractors. And you would have very different performance. So for example, right now we're getting a lot of unionization again in the United States, of Starbucks, of Amazon. So that's changing the nature of the economic performance. Most likely means workers will get more pay, maybe more benefits, better working conditions. It could also mean that there are fewer jobs perhaps. So there's all, and that's a traditional neoclassical view, of course, is that unions cost jobs and so forth. But what we're looking at is a little differently. We're not going to impose efficiency. We're not going to say one alternative is better than the other. We're going to look at those different structures. And we're going to be much more explicit about the legal system than a traditional model would be. We do use some of the traditional ideas. So for example, if it's a common pool resource or a public good, then the biophysical identity might matter a lot. So you might have to bring in some of these ideas into your analysis, like Elinor Ostrom, the institutional economist who won the Nobel Prize in 2009. She often uses these things. And we would use these things too if it was appropriate, to the situation. If it's a private good, it may not matter as much. But if it's a public good in the traditional language, now, for example, my mentors didn't like the term public good. And the reason is they said, well, that assumes the nature of the thing, that it has to be public. Well, it may be public, but it doesn't, there may be other options. So again, we try and be careful about the terminology because the terminology can often infer, whereas private goods, maybe some private goods should be public, right? I mean, so these notions of like that terminology, private, public good is even problematic. But that is a term that's very common in economics, of course. Just other examples. This is what my other mentor, Al Schmidt, used. He talked about high exclusion costs, economies of scale, incompatible use. So he was trying to come up with different language for the same ideas. And I won't go through this in detail. We don't have time, but he's written many books on this and thinks about, he had a great terminology, like not only who was the free rider, because like in public goods, you often have free riders, for example, but he talked about the unwilling rider. So like if the good is being forced on someone who doesn't want it. And so forth. So these are some of the things. We do have this in our book as well. So example, again, the traveler has the power to create a new right, which will impose a duty on the hotel. Prior to the exercise of that power, it's a liability on that hotel or lodge. So the power can become a right and the liability can become the duty. Like I said, the hotel owner still has the right to demand payment. And if there's no vacancy, then that changes the structure. There is no power then. But again, it's correlating. It's thinking about that interdependence that's critical. This is kind of the full table. So a right is correlated to a duty. The opposite of a right is exposure, because when the right ends, you're exposed. And again, this is just a simple little table that gives you the way to think through these ideas. Another thing, this is John Common's model. One of the things he added in was that there are officials, right? So if you break the rules, even if you trespass on my property and you have a duty not to, now there are some cases where I have the ability to act on that transgression, but in many cases I may have to call on official, the government official, to enforce the law for me. And so then I have to bring in government officials into this equation. So this is all that's doing, is sort of starting to ask the question, okay, you have the people interacting, or even the companies, but then you have government officials also, where I have to use my power to ask the court or the sheriff or the police or whoever to act on my behalf to do something. So then you can even have a little more comprehensive analysis of the enforcement side of this. We also, in our book, and we won't have time to go through a lot of this, but we bring in ideas that are compound. So the word liberty may sound like liberty means freedom to do whatever I want. Well, no, it doesn't. What it specifically means is you have a right and a privilege at the same time. So that can come together, right? And what that means is I have a right, meaning there's a duty, but I also have a privilege to act, which means, because a right doesn't mean anything about what I can do. It only means what somebody else can do or has to do or not do. The privilege gives me the act to do something. So it might be important for me to have a right and the privilege to act as well. And that's a more powerful thing than if I just had the privilege. So it's a compound idea. And so we use this term liberty to mean right and privilege. And we have a whole bunch of others in the book like this, because obviously situations are often complex and you need to think about them. But at the end of the day, we're still trying to provide a simplified view of the world. It's a map of the world. It's not the world itself. This is in contrast to some of the English jurists who claim things like the right of property is absolute, total. This is William Blackstone, the English jurist. Whereas our friend Holofield, he talks about rights and privileges and how they can be broken up. And in English, we use the term the bundle. So it's like you have a bundle of rights and duties, and you can sort of pick one out. And actually, courts will do this. They'll say, well, this piece of your right is being pulled out now, and now it's only a privilege. But you still have some other rights. For example, I have the right to the land, but do I have the right to the air? So when airplanes first came in, actually, people were arguing, I have the right to the air above my land in infinity. So if you fly over my land, you have to pay me for that ability. Otherwise, I have the duty to stop you. Okay, now that was not practical, and that would have stopped all air traffic, right? So what happened was the court said, you don't have the right to all the air above your house. Like, you basically only have it maybe up to your house and like a little bit above that, and that's it. So everything above whatever, 50 feet or whatever it is, 100 feet, like that's open space, and actually is, in many cases controlled by the government in essence. And so, this is an example where, again, we pulled that out of your bundle. You didn't get that anymore. You didn't have a right. And the same is true underground. A lot of people don't realize they don't own or control a lot of what's under their house, for example. So that's an example of the bundle, so-called bundle of rights. And the key is, like, then that bundle can be broken down, it can be composed or decomposed, and this provides for a lot of interesting analysis. Yeah, so I'm not going to go through that piece. Let me talk about some examples and then we'll open up some questions. So this is a recent case in the US. Well, sorry, it's an important case. It's fairly old now, but it was called Chevron, which is the Chevron company, big oil company, versus the National Resources Defense Council, the NRDC, which is a environmental organization. And the argument was about when there's a law written by Congress or government, how should that be interpreted if the law is unclear? And what the Supreme Court decided in the United States was that if the law was unclear, that the government got the advantage. Now, why would that be important in the case of a Holofieldian analysis? Well, it matters because it means the government gets more of the privilege to sort of decide what the law really means. And if in this case, if you're Chevron, you're on the losing side. So you're sort of exposed to potential damages from the government's actions. Because the government might say, no, you do have to clean up that oil spill, or you do have to cap your emissions somehow, right? So this is an important, and it's critical in the way we think about our analysis, is often looking at these kind of court cases using Hofeldian analysis to say, how does this shape the world and how does this shape the economic world? And this is a big one that has often been under attack since it was decided. And I won't go into this, but it's a very complex case, but it was just decided on June 15th. As you probably know, the Supreme Court is making all kinds of important decisions right now. And this one is a very unknown case, but it was really important because these hospitals were paid by the government a certain amount of money. And the hospital said, no, the government was paying them too little. And so, so they sued. And this Becerra is the head of the US Health Agency, basically. It's the guy they sued. What the court said in this case is they didn't overturn Chevron. So in US law, which is you have sort of the English system of law, so-called common law, and then you have civil law systems, which is France and Italy and sort of the Napoleonic systems. But in our case, judges do make law, even though they often say they don't. And so in this case, they sort of made these decisions about that the hospitals were right. And why that's important is because they're saying, well, you, the government, you thought you were doing the right thing, but you were actually wrong. So they were pulling away from the government and shifting rights towards private economic agents. And that has huge implications because this is billions of dollars of money being paid to these hospitals. And so this is a great example where you see a shift in the Hofeldian system leading to huge impacts in performance in the economy. And not just affecting these hospitals, but it will affect other things because it will have impacts on other industries and the way government acts in all kinds of ways, not just in this specific case under the common law system. So that's why it's important when we look at these cases, we understand using our Hofeldian analysis to see how this is going to affect the economic performance. Another one I'll end with is the so-called gay cake case. A gay couple went in to purchase a cake from Mr. Phillips, who's a baker. He owns this Masterpiece Cake Shop in Denver, Colorado. He refused to sell it because he believed his religious views prevented him from doing it. He would give them a cake, a generic cake, but not a custom cake. Now, the traditional economists might say, well, why don't they just go somewhere else and get the cake, right? But these people felt that they had their rights violated. They felt they had a right and that he was under a duty as a public business to provide them this cake. They filed a complaint with the Civil Rights Commission in Colorado, which is a government agency that enforces civil rights laws. The commission ruled against Mr. Phillips and said he had to go through training. Now, this was a very controversial case. There's been similar cases in Australia and Britain and so forth. Then he took it to the Supreme Court and he won. And the court argued, well, because of free speech, you have the right to speak, and that making a cake is a form of free speech. And therefore, we believe your free speech rights have been violated. And this, this is a good example where I always use this with students to say, well, isn't it free markets? I mean, what does that mean in this case? Free market for who? Should the couple have the freedom to get the cake they want? Or should the baker have the right to sort of have producer rights to say, I don't want to make this cake, And again, some traditional economists might say, well, just, there's markets. Like if they don't like this guy, they'll go somewhere else and get the cake, But unfortunately, if you looked at the pre-civil rights era in the United States, that was everywhere. Like African Americans couldn't go anywhere. And so are we just going to say, well, that's okay now? We're going to have businesses that can basically say no to customers all over the place. And are we going to have a whole system like this? Again, I'm agnostic, but I think we have to be, using the term free market doesn't answer this question. It just doesn't. You have to think about where the rights and duties lie and where the privileges and exposures lie. And in this case, it's really a power question because it's a question of the power of the couple to come in and impose a duty on someone. So I think we've gone pretty long, so I want to kind of stop and open up for questions, and thank you again, and happy to talk, answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Scorsone, for your very interesting presentation today. And so for the opening of this debate, I'd like to ask you a question about the current and most recent situation involving the pandemic. The high prices of importing vaccines, as well as raw materials for vaccine production, has put pressure on the balance of payments for many economies, especially developing countries. So my question is, do you think it's possible that the legal system could change property rights, forcing large pharmaceutical companies to reduce their prices in order to match the global demand for vaccines? And in this context, how the institutions could deal with the differences between legal systems of different countries?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question. Very important question. I think, so let's start with some basics. I mean, many of the major pharmaceutical companies, especially those located in the United States and in Europe, operate under legal systems that essentially create legal monopolies, especially in the US system, right? So you have essentially this idea that you have a theory that says we need that because we won't invest the billions of dollars to produce these drugs. So we want this legal protection for some period of time, which, you know, often seems to be very extended and then extended again, right? And that's the theory that people say. Now, absolutely, that is a choice we're making. To be clear, because a lot of times you hear this, well, it's the natural thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Well, it's a choice we've made to have a system like that. Does that mean a different system couldn't produce the same vaccines? And I think the answer is we don't know, because quite frankly, we haven't tried it. We just seem to assume that the current system is the only option. And I would suggest that, yes, I think a different system could be done. Because again, why do we have to assume it's a private good? Why can't we just say it's a public good? Because, you know, the reality of these vaccines is the United States government spent billions of dollars essentially guaranteeing that these companies would make a huge profit, right? I mean, that's essentially what happened here, is the Trump administration basically passed the CARES Act in 2020, and it basically guaranteed massive amounts of money to pharmaceutical companies to produce the vaccine. The other thing it did that's really important, and it's a little bit related to this, is it also said, you as employers will be held not responsible if your employees get sick. That was a huge thing, and that went under the radar. And I think, yes, we could have a different system, because a lot of this technology comes out of universities, it comes out of nonprofit world, and then these companies take it and use it. And so I absolutely believe there are different ways we could do this that would help the entire world. It's ironic in this case, because in most cases, the US drug prices are very high, and that's a real problem, right? Because a lot of Americans will go to Canada to get drugs. I mean, I live in Michigan, I'm very close to Canada. A lot of people I know go to Canada to get a lot of drugs for, say, diabetes or other kinds of things because they're cheaper in Canada. In this case, it's actually the other side, right? And it's not just price, it's the availability of the vaccine and even of therapeutics as well in the developing world. So yeah, I think we could have a different system. I don't like it when people sort of try and scare you into thinking if you change it, the whole thing's going to blow up. And I'm not suggesting that that wouldn't happen. I'm not suggesting there are consequences to decisions. Of course there are, and we have to be careful. We have to be thoughtful. And I'm not saying like just blow up the system and don't worry about it. Like that's not responsible either. But I do think we have to ask tough questions and say, is this really the only way to do it? Because I think in a lot of cases it isn't. And you know, people, economists love that unintended consequences. Well, if you do that, you know, this could happen, all these bad things. And I'm not saying that bad things might not, yeah, there may be consequences, but the question is for who? Who are those consequences for? For the shareholders of Abbott Pharmaceuticals or people like that? Perhaps, yes. So, yeah, I just think you have to challenge the status quo. Absolutely. I think we have a responsibility to challenge the status quo and at least ask the questions. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for your answer. Rodrigo, are there any questions from the YouTube?
Yes, there's a question
From the
from,
audience?
yes, there's a question from Guilherme. He's a PhD candidate in our program, a graduate program. He asked if you could give more examples about the Chevron case that you were talking about, how that happened, and what were the developments of that.
Yeah, it's complicated, but I'll try and explain. So when the government writes a law, and I'm sure Brazilian government, writes laws, obviously language, whether it's Portuguese or English or French or whatever it is, there's ambiguity, obviously, that you can't write everything down perfectly. So of course, and I've actually been a government official in my career, and I know that I can look at a law and say, well, I think it means this, but it could mean this. And so there's an ambiguity to it, right? What are the rules? And so that's where this comes into play. So because obviously the companies or even the individuals might say, well, I want the ruling that's favorable to me, right? I want the ruling that's good for me. And the government may have a different view. It says, no, that you're wrong. Like, we think this is the way it should be. So there's a conflict, right, between understanding what the law means. The Chevron case said the government gets the sort of the advantage, because if the government comes up with a good explanation, I mean, the government can't just come up with some random idea. It has to be clearly thought out and reasoned. But if the government has a good reasoned argument for why it thinks the law is this way rather than the other way, then the government generally wins. That's the basic rule. And so you can actually think of it in terms of rights and duties, and it essentially gives more rights and maybe even more privileges. I might even argue it's a liberty to the government agency to sort of be able to understand a law, and the courts are going to defer to that agency's understanding of the law. Now, obviously, some industries don't like that. They don't like the idea that the agency is interpreting laws in their favor, and so they're going to fight it. And what's happened in the Supreme Court of the United States is this ruling, the Chevron ruling, came in the 1970s. Now in the 2000s, we're seeing a shift toward the other direction. Now, some people thought this American hospital case would be the end of Chevron. Like, they would literally overrule Chevron and say, no more Chevron. It's going to now be against the government. Because a lot of the conservatives on the US Supreme Court, they want to kill Chevron. They hate Chevron. In fact, to be quite frank, they don't like government in general, to be honest. But that's a different story, and that's their view, and they have the right to those views. And we're seeing that in many cases coming out in the last few days from the U.S. Supreme Court that are happening as well. But the battle, it's a battle. The bottom line is, from just an empirical analysis or sort of conceptual analysis point of view, you're looking at the shifting of rights and duties. And so Chevron shifted rights and duties a certain way. If they were to eliminate Chevron, so what people are saying is they're not going to overrule Chevron. Like, they're not just going to write it down and say Chevron no longer exists. But what they're going to do is kill it slowly. So each case they decide sort of makes it weaker and weaker and weaker. And that matters. So if you're doing this analysis, that matters. You sort of see the shift happening, and you need to address your analysis in that way. And so that's what we're seeing right now happening with the Chevron decision.
Great, thank you. I don't think we have more questions. So I have only one more question, is that at the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about how institutional economics is coming back, right? And it's growing in importance. I can see this here in Brazil. I don't know about the United States, how you perceive that, but in your opinion, in your impression, why do you think this is happening? Why is institutional economics coming back? And how important it is for young scholars and those who are learning or starting to study institutional economics to also have this conscience about how laws matter for economists, how words matter too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the way I was taught here at Michigan State was that again, we don't turn away from neoclassical. We don't even turn away from econometrics or these tools we have. We can use these tools. And there's many examples in many journals where you can use your tools, operations research, econometrics, whatever it may be. But what we're asking you to do is stop and think about the words. Like I always teach it this way. I say, before we start optimizing something, let's think about what it is who's in the equation in the first place that we're optimizing. Like who gets what, why is something a cost? Like who decided it was a cost? Like that isn't just something that comes out of nature. Like we decide through a system of rules what's cost to who, and we decide who has what rights to what even prices or production or anything. So what I ask people to do is before you start optimizing, and you can use your optimization tools, absolutely. But again, let's say ask these questions about starting from first principles. And then we can do a much better analysis. We can do a comparative analysis, I would argue. The one thing I do kind of, and I'm against, quite frankly, is economic efficiency as some kind of definitive tool that decides the argument. I don't think it does. And I see too often economists using it to say, yep, this is efficient. This institutional alternative is efficient. The rest aren't efficient. They're inefficient. So, okay, well, you can do number two, but it's inefficient. See, and I don't, that's one thing I am against. I don't like. I think that's quite frankly a wrong analysis. I think there's efficiency point 1, efficiency point 2, efficiency point 3, and they're not comparable. And I will say this at the end of the day, our tool does force you to kind of reconcile back to the moral principles of how things are happening and why they're happening. And again, who gets what? So rather than going to free markets and so throwing around these words, well, that's a market failure. Why would you do that? Don't be careful of how you use terminology. So again, I'm fine. Even if you want to be just a neoclassical economist, I would still argue you should be careful about your language, about how you're framing things, and that you need to think about that. So even if you want to go down the traditional route, I would argue institutional can help you at least think about that. I would hope you would consider doing more full institutional analysis because I think it's a very rich idea. It's an idea that can get at the underpinnings of the economy. We're coming up to the 100th anniversary of John Common's book, The Legal Foundations of Capitalism, which is really, I think, one of the most important books, definitely not much read, unfortunately, but is really foundational to the work I do. And so I would encourage people, I think in our day and age, when we're facing climate change, when we're facing, these pandemics, which unfortunately, from what the experts say, we're not, there'll probably be more of these kinds of things. We're going to face other challenges, that these legal systems really do matter. And again, I would like economists to sort of dig in and understand that and say, there are tools you can use here to understand that legal system and how that legal system affects the economy. And so I would encourage people to go into that kind of field and think about it. And you can do comparative internationally. You could compare, Brazil to Argentina to, Ecuador, or you can, maybe to Europe or who knows what. I mean, there's a really wealth of stuff that can be done here. So I think you're getting in on the ground level of some really important work. And I want to address the elephant in the room, which is, the whole problem of tenure, of, job security, all the kind of things, at least in the US system. Yes, people say, well, if you do this, you'll be, sort of marginalized and whatever. I'm not going to say you might run into some problems. I'll be honest about that. But I do think it's more accepted nowadays, generally speaking. There are at least half a dozen Nobel Prizes to institutional economists. It's not some weird outlier anymore. So I think it's much more comfortable space than it was 20, 30 years ago. So.
Great. Thank you, Eric. There's one more question here in YouTube. it's from Lucas. He's an undergraduate student here at UNESP. He asked if you could tell the differences, the main differences of your approach or model from that of Coe's, Coe's approach.
Sure. Yeah. So Coe's, I've actually learned a lot from Coe's. He is considered more of a new institutional economist, or even maybe the founder of the so-called new institutional economics, which what is the difference? I mean, they tend to say that efficiency is a sort of tool you can use. For example, that Douglas North, who is a sort of colleague of Coase, would say, this institutional way is efficient and these other ways aren't. Now, I don't agree with that, but I learned from Coase and from North. I absolutely do. And in fact, in my teaching, I do talk about Coase, because Coase is quite radical. In fact, even though he may not have even recognized it, Coase was very radical in the sense of he thought about interdependence, and he actually blew up the traditional models of externalities by saying, he had the famous example of the candy maker and the doctor who lived next door to each other, and the candy maker was causing all this noise. And this is a case from England back in like the 1800s or something. And so the doctor who had set up his home office couldn't operate anymore because everything was shaking all the time. And then the question was, well, who caused the externality? Coase has been captured, I'll use that term, by the University of Chicago, sort of law and economics people. But I actually think Coase is quite radical. And there are legal scholars who have written about Coase this way as well. So while I understand some people think, oh, Coase, he's like the neoclassical stuff, the new institutional economics. Yes, he is in some ways. He was quite libertarian, I think, in his own views of the world. But I think he does have some stuff to teach us. I mean, especially his social cost article in particular. So I do think about it. I do use it. Again, the difference I would say is that he probably does tend to think about efficiency more so as a tool, and he is more libertarian. I mean, he's definitely viewing government as more of a negative. I mean, I view myself more neutrally, like is the government and the economy are always coexisting, and that it's not a question of like, is the government good or bad? It's a question of there is government, it's there, and it's going to influence things. Like even if I say less government, that's still government, right? It's still there somehow. So I just, Coase still kind of, he tends to go into that government intervention kind of terminology at times. So anyway, that's a short answer, but it's a very complex issue. But yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Eric. We have 2 more questions. Are you okay with that? Can we
it's fine,
go through these questions? Great. So this one is from Daniele. Daniele Morin. She is part of our organizing committee. And she asked, how can we use your methodology, your analysis to understand the ride-hailing apps or digital platforms? Yeah.
Yeah. I know it's an issue dear and dear to your heart, Rodrigo.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I think absolutely. So ride-hailing apps are part of the platform economy, the gig economy, whatever term you want to use. And that's shaped the economy very differently, right? Because the idea initially was, well, there's these people out there that have some, maybe spare time, and hey, they could drive for a few hours using their vehicle, and we Uber will connect the two, right? We'll connect the consumer with the seller, and so and that was an interesting idea to start with, right? It was it's obviously grown massively. It's had huge implications for the economy, for land use, for transportation, etc. Our model can ask like, okay, well, who has the rights under this system? Who has the duties? Is the the app itself? You have the app company, right? Uber or Lyft or whoever. You have the consumer, right? And then you have the seller of the actual services. And so you have a 3-way system now, and you can think about where the legal system lies. Now, in the US, the argument has often been about, are they contractors or employees? Because that matters, because if they're employees of Uber, right, they work for Uber, then they have to have certain rights, labor rights. They have to be paid certain ways and get certain benefits. Now, obviously, Uber as a profit maximizing firm doesn't want to pay those costs. Again, that's a question of who gets to decide what a cost is, right? The law defines what a cost is ultimately in this case. So in the US, in most cases, Uber drivers are contractors. And that's important because under the Internal Revenue Service, our IRS, which is our tax agency, that's really critical because now it means I, as the driver, it's tough for me because first of all, I don't have the labor rights, but secondly, my taxes are quite different. And in fact, much higher because as an employee, my employer would have to pay some of the taxes. Now I have all the tax burden on me. Not only that, I have to file my taxes. I probably have to hire an accountant because it's quite complicated. That means more cost to me. So these are examples how the legal system is basically allowing Uber to impose costs on the drivers versus the drivers imposing costs on Uber, because that's the legal system structure. And in most states in the US today, Uber drivers are contractors still. California tried to change that and it failed. There's been a lot of court cases about this in the US, but as of now, essentially, those kinds of drivers are primarily contractors still. So, and that's how you could use this legal analysis to understand, I mean, one aspect, and there's many other aspects. For example, Airbnb. What if I go and rent your facility, and then what happens if someone falls and gets injured? Who's liable? Is it the renter? Is it the owner? The legal system will have to sort that out. And this became a real problem with Airbnbs because it was like, you know, who is liable now? Or in tourism areas, like Barcelona famously was like, we're sick of these Airbnbs and all these tourists everywhere. So we want to restrict that. So that's another legal issue. Like how many Airbnbs in Michigan, that's been a big issue because hotels, of course, don't like Airbnb, right? They want to keep the monopoly for themselves. So in Michigan, which is a big vacation state in the summer, they were fighting it, saying, no, Airbnb will be restricted. Government can restrict the number of Airbnbs in our community. And that's been a big battle here for a number of years. So it's still ongoing. So that's an example of how these my favorite one is in San Francisco. There was a company that set up an app that said it would tell you where there were parking spaces available. And the city of San Francisco, like, wait a second, like we own that stuff. You can't tell people. Like it was, you know, an interesting battle over like who got to decide where people could park and so forth. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in the app economy now and the app economy is actually a ripe area for this analysis. Absolutely.
That's sure great. Yeah, the app economy. I think all of the challenges we're having here in South America, especially here in Brazil, the app economy is everywhere. Not only ride hailing, but even teachers and everything's going through the platform economy. So yeah, the challenges are not stopping right now. So Eric, we have another question. Now it's from Mauricio. He asks if you think that the institutional environment can be influenced by government, but what kind of party, what party is in power, such as the Democrat or Republican government, or there's no relation between it?
No, I mean, you know, if you're a political scientist, you're going to study that kind of stuff, right? You're going to study if a certain party is in power, they will likely favor some types of institutional alternatives over others. So absolutely, I mean, you could call it political economy analysis. Like another way to do this analysis would be to say, I want to understand why some places pass laws like this and other places pass laws like that. So that would be a political economy analysis. We also call it institutional change. I've been mostly talking about institutional impact analysis, but you could do institutional change analysis, which is where what happens is in my model, performance is the dependent variable and institutions are the independent variable. You could flip that around and say, I want to understand why institutions vary, right, as a dependent variable. And I could have political party, I could have business structure, you know, industry types on the independent variable side. So you could absolutely do that analysis to say, why does Michigan have this kind of law and why does California have a different kind of law for ride hailing or Airbnb or whatever it is. So yeah, you can absolutely, we don't focus a lot on our book on that. We kind of talk about it at the end a little bit, but yeah, that's absolutely another way to do this, is to flip it the other direction and think about how political structures would impact institutional choices. And then just to say, I just want to put out a shout out to our podcast, Legal Economic Nexus, which is on Apple, Spotify, all the major podcasting apps. It's we basically interview institutional economists and get their thoughts on how things are shaping up, how the ideas have evolved over time. So I'd certainly encourage you to. We just did a really good interview with couple really cool interviews. Jeff Hodgson, who's a very famous institutional economist he's at I can't remember, he changed universities, but he's in England anyway. I can't remember exactly which one now. And then we also do William Singer, who's a Harvard law professor, but has a real deep understanding of sort of this law economic connection. So those are a couple recent ones we've done. And we're kind of on hiatus. We're going to be doing season 2 coming up here, but definitely encourage you to check that out if you can.
Great, thank you. I've written your podcast name on YouTube here for people to look for it. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you very much, Professor Eric Scorsone. Thank you for sharing with us his important insights about institutional economics. Today we had a very rich debate, so thank you for allowing this. Now I'm going to ask Daniela Amorim, our PhD student, to finish this event. And before this, I would like to thank our students for having organized this event. Without them, this meeting wouldn't have happened. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Professor Eric Scorsone, Tatiana, Massaroli, Rodrigo, and everyone who's watching on our YouTube channel. It's lovely to meet you, Professor Scorsone, even if it is in person. 2 weeks ago, we were commented that one of the few benefits of the pandemic is the possibility to have repeated lectures at events like this without large expenses. It's a great honor to have you at the 9th scientific meeting of the postgraduate program in economics at the São Paulo State University. Our economic master science degree program is 25 years old. Our PhD is 4 years old. And this event is full organized by us, the students. It's exciting work in detail in all aspects of this event. And in the end, realize it was all worth it. We are always happy to invite lecturers from our country and around the world to talk about science, research, and results. We really love to do this. We truly appreciate your presence, Professor Eric. Thank you for taking the time to be here to talk about your last book. I haven't read the opportunity to read it, but it will be my next read. I am sure that your brilliant conference inspired our audience to look for a little more about the relationship between institutional economics and legal concepts. We are absolutely delighted. We are so grateful to our other lecturers, Professors Ademar, Bruno, Guilherme, Clário, Fernando, Susana, Fábio, Danilo, Paiva, Michael, Laura, André, and Rodrigo, all of whom accepted our invitation readily and made it possible to talk about the subjects that we propose. Summarize the main idea, we can say, first, and the panel of the ecological, economic, and energy transition, it will be necessary to balance transition, its limits, and the demands of developing countries in terms of growth. Second, in infrastructure and regional inequality, we need to rethink our regional political administrative model and the role of infrastructure in our country. In the fiscal policy, it's mandatory to change the current fiscal rules and prioritize the public investment and income distribution policy. Last one, inequality and the labor market. The reversal of the precariousness of the labor market is necessary, as well as focus and inclusion, because both have increased our inequality levels. Yes, in 3 days, we have certainly discussed the problem for the next 30 years or more. Also, words cannot describe how grateful we are to our team who worked hard to facilitate this event. I'd like to thank you everyone by name, but it's impossible. So I will do that through the leaders of the meeting committees. Mateus, Scientific Committee, Vania, Advised Committee, Lucas, Technical Committee. Of course, I especially wish to thank you, the coordinators of this event, João, Guilherme, and Tatiana. I feel we are redefining our learning path edition by edition. Also, I'm thankful to the postgraduate program in economics coordinator, Professor Tatiana Massaroli, and the vice coordinator, Professor Soraya Gasparetto. Thank you for your trust and support. Furthermore, I'm grateful to all the professors who spent time to analyze the 57 papers we received, and the authors who sent the papers and gave us the opportunity to contribute to the research. We know we have a lot to do to increase the assessment indicators of our postgraduate program, but we also know we are heading in the right direction. Paraphrasing Hippocrates, there are in fact two things: science and opinion. The former beget knowledge, the latter ignorance. From this, we know our approach is correct, because it isn't possible to have a developed country without research and education. As Paulo Freire told us, there is no such thing as teaching without research and research without teaching. We need to keep on talk about science and education in our country, so that becomes a priority again. For this, we need to change the political and economic chaos that we have nowadays. Think when you make your choice in October 2nd. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciated your participation here. See you in the 10th edition. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Dani. Thank you very much, Professor Scorsone, Rodrigo, João.
Yes,
Thank you for
everyone.
Our students.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like a great event you put on, so thank you.
Sure.
Have a good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all.